Okay, I think we'll get started. Welcome to the Colorado Grain Chains Homeschool Webinar Series. My name is Dan Waldvogel. I'm the membership coordinator with the Rocky Mountain Farmers Union. Thank you for tuning in today. Just a little bit, we'll start with housekeeping. Today, the best way to ask a question is to use the Q&A function. It should be towards the bottom of your screen. Just click on the Q&A and you can type your question in there. There is the chat box as well if you need to try to get something expressed to folks on the call. But the best way to get a question out is through that Q&A function. So please use that. Absolutely welcome questions. I think that's some of the best way to have some of these discussions. We are in for a treat today. We have Jeremy Cherfas joining us as our speaker. Jeremy is a self-described freelance communicator. In his bio on his website, he lists himself essentially as a translator. He speaks science and he speaks English, and he works hard to make the two understand each other. He is a published journalist, including being regularly published in NPR's The Salt, and he also makes the Eat This podcast, which was nominated for a James Beard Foundation Award in 2015 and 2016. So we're definitely in for a treat. Thank you so much for joining us today, Jeremy, and I'll hand it off to you. Thanks a lot.
Okay, thank you so much, Dan. Well, this is so funny. I mean, this is so strange. Me sitting in Rome, which is where I live, talking to people, some of them in Colorado, but I guess people elsewhere too. I need to thank Andrew Calabresi and Andy Clark. I met Andrew in Edinburgh, 3-4 years ago now, it seems. And when he found out that I had family in Denver, he insisted that I had to meet Andy at Moxie. And we had a terrific visit on a freezing cold day a couple of years ago. And many thanks also to Dan Waldvogel. Let me tell you a bit more about myself. As Dan mentioned, by training and by inclination, I'm a biologist. I like understanding living things and how they operate and how they interact. And I'm always learning new stuff, but I'm also a journalist. I've worked in print, radio, TV, online, and more or less as soon as the internet allowed it, I jumped on as a place where I could be my own publisher. Mostly these days, that's my podcast, Eat This Podcast, and bits and bobs of writing here and there. So this kind of thing, this grain chain lesson, home lesson, is sort of something I really enjoy doing because I can share things I've learned, mostly biological things. So it's heaven for me. So let me give you a bit of background and tell you how I came to bake bread. I think I may be possibly the only person in the world who decided to start baking as a rebellion against home-baked bread. And it's kind of weird because my mom was a very early, I don't want to call her a health nut, but she was certainly very into healthy eating. We had John Yudkin books on the shelves. We had Adele Davis books on the shelves. And she used to bake this bread called the Grant Loaf, which was invented in 1944, more or less, by a woman called Doris Grant to help the Brits make the most of their wartime rations. And the Grant Loaf, in my memory, you got 100% whole wheat flour. You added a lot of water, warm water, and a lot of yeast. You warmed everything up. You stirred it into a kind of gloopy mess. You poured it into a tin. You put it somewhere warm for about 30 to 45 minutes max. And then you stuck it in the oven. So it was one rise with a lot of yeast, 100% wholemeal, and it came out more or less like a brick. It was very tasty, but it wasn't quite what I wanted. And my mom, being very sensible, said, "You don't like it, make your own." And so I did. I started baking. I was a teenager. This was the 60s. I started using Elizabeth David's book of English bread and yeast cookery. Some of you in the US will know Bernard Clayton Jr.'s books, and I had that. Those were my two go-to books. I used to scream at the Clayton because all of his measurements were in cups and they made absolutely no sense to me. But that was how I learned to bake. And then about 20 years later, I remember seeing a correction in the paper we used to read, which was The Independent. I wish I could remember what the mistake was, but the correction was to a recipe to make your own sourdough starter. And I thought, kind of knew vaguely about sourdough starters. I'd learned about them in college and what have you. And I thought, well, if it was worth correcting, it might be worth trying. And so I made my first starter. And I'm not absolutely sure when that was. It must have been the late 1980s, because the chap who wrote the recipe in the Independent newspaper, a lovely, lovely man called Jeremy Round, he died in 1989. And I still have the bit of paper I copied the details onto. And when I knew I was going to be talking to you, I went and found it and looked at it again. I'm going to share my screen now, I hope. That one, this one, that one. So this is, I hope, I don't expect you to be able to read it, but I would actually be happy to share it eventually if you would like me to. But this is the thing I copied out from the Independent onto a bit of notepaper, and I did it. And actually, if you look at it now, it's not how you would prepare a starter these days, I don't think. But the amazing thing is that it worked, and I still have that starter. That starter has traveled around with me an awful lot. It's almost died. It's always been recovered eventually, and it's my main starter today. So that's how I got into baking, and I'm still baking. I bake for friends. I bake once or twice a week. Almost all sourdough. We can talk about that later if you want. But what I want to do now is talk to you about a thing called the Chorleywood bread process, which it's how the English get Wonder Bread, and not just the English, but a lot of countries, how we get white, soft, fluffy bread. I called this the worst thing since sliced bread. I'd never quite, I mean, sliced bread is wonderful. You know, you look at sliced bread and it is quite astonishing how it actually happens. But sliced bread is much older than the Trolleywood bread process. And the American version of the bread that gets sliced, fluffy white Wonder Bread, is a lot older than the Chorleywood bread process. But the Chorleywood bread process is a very British solution to a very British problem. The problem it's solving is the same, which is how to make bread in very much less time than you need to make what I would call a proper loaf of bread. It starts with 2 to 5 minutes of very energetic mixing of the ingredients. And those ingredients are flour, water, yeast, and a variety of different things called dough improvers. At the very least, you've got a hard fat and you've got vitamin C, ascorbic acid. And immediately after this mixing, the dough is divided into bits, portions, which could be large loaves, they could be small rolls, anything in between. They move on a conveyor belt for about 8 minutes and then they get shaped. Little fermentation takes place because they've got more or less double the yeast in a conventional dough to make up for the reduced time. Then after shaping, the dough will often rest in a tin for up to 45 minutes. During that, it continues to rise. It's then baked for about 20 to 25 minutes in a continuous oven before it gets cooled for a couple of hours, and the loaves are sliced and wrapped. And the whole process takes about 3 hours from start to finish, 3.5, 3 to 3.5. A traditional loaf in a traditional high street bakery in England takes about 6 hours or more. And about half of that, 3 hours, is the bulk fermentation. So what happened to create the Chorleywood bread process? Well, in the 1950s, Chorleywood was a small town on the edge of London. It's kind of been swallowed up now, and it was the home of the British Baking Industries Research Association. This building is where it was. It's now an old people's home. The BBIRA was set up with government money and a levy on bakeries. So they paid a percentage of their, I think it depended on their turnover. And it was set up to carry out generic research that would be of value to British bakers. And going back to that time in the early 1950s, bread was produced in hundreds, maybe thousands of small bakeries. But at the same time, in Canada, Westerns had pioneered a factory approach to bread with model bakery factories in Toronto. And you've got to remember that at this time, Canada was part of the British Commonwealth. So Westerns came to the UK, they brought that setup to the UK, and they imported lots of Canadian wheat to run their bakeries. And the point about Canadian wheat, as I'm sure you'll know, is that it's high protein. And it's got a good mix of the gluten proteins that make the gluten network. And it's a stronger flour. And with a stronger flour, the same amount of flour produces a greater volume of bread. So even though it costs some to import wheat from Canada, Western's bakeries could produce cheaper bread than British bakeries. And the small bakeries were suffering. They turned to the British Baking Industries Research Association to help them. And they wanted two things. First, they wanted to speed up the whole process. So they could bake bread more quickly, which meant more turnover per day. And secondly, they wanted to be able to use low protein British wheat, which you certainly couldn't use in the Wonder Bread process that had been developed in the US. So the BBIRA knew about the process in the US, and they tried that, but it didn't work with the British wheats, as I said. And on the way, they stumbled on something, because they took small amounts of conventional dough, gave it a bit of extra mixing, and that enabled them to almost completely do away with bulk fermentation. And one of the books, Covian and Young, they were two of the people who more or less developed Chorleywood, said that they could make identical bread, identical or superior to conventionally made British bread. Okay, I don't need to tell you about gluten networks, but basically what's going on is that the Chorleywood bread process is using energy to develop the gluten network. Now, when you knead, you're putting energy into the bread. And when you leave time to do the work, the energy in the water basically is allowing the gluten network to form. But if you really smoosh the molecules together by mixing them very, very strenuously, then you build the gluten network in almost no time at all. So once they discovered that they could get away with, that they didn't need to do a bulk fermentation if they did this strenuous mixing, the next thing was to work out in a scientific way, well, what exactly does it take? So they looked at the amount of mixing needed, and this is I love this. This is how they tested the quality of their procedure. This is putting a different amount of work into the dough and baking the loaf, and then you just slice through the loaf and trace the outline, and the outline that gives you the largest volume is the one that is best. And they reckoned that the one the two at the top right were the most optimum amount of energy. Putting in more didn't really give you any benefit. You also need to add a fat to help it rise. So here are two fuzzy photographs, I'm afraid, that I stole out of a book. On the right is the control, which is the one with fat, and on the left is the loaf, identical production except with no fat. And I think that the science is that the fat lubricates the gluten network so that in the oven, the strands slide over each other, so you get more oven spring, more rise than you do without the fat. But it has to be a hard fat, and you can get a perfectly good spring, as you know, without it. And then they looked at a whole variety of additives. The one I mentioned already was vitamin C. Vitamin C, ascorbic acid, helps the gluten bonds to break and to reform, so that as all that energy is going in the mixing, the gluten bonds are broken with the help of the ascorbic acid, and then they're helped to come together again. In the US, I think they're still using potassium bromate as the main oxidizing agent when they make Wonder Bread. I might be wrong on that, but that's been banned in Europe for a long time. There are all sorts of unhelpful side effects of bromates. Anyway, vitamin C is just one of a whole range of chemicals called dough improvers. And I'm sure you know that even home bakers sometimes crush up a small vitamin C tablet and put it in the dough if they're looking for a bit of a rocket fuel addition to get the dough to rise. Lots and lots and lots of other enzymes and other chemicals that industrial bakers use to make the dough more predictable and to make the whole process faster. And dough improvers are big, big business. Essentially, they even out any kind of difference between the flour from different wheat varieties, different mills, that sort of thing. You can't make industrial bread without them. I do find it odd, though, almost wherever you find websites dedicated to baking improvers, you have hands, dusty hands working the flour. And that's not something that you ever see in an actual industrial bread factory. The hands never touch the dough. Anyway, so let's talk about some of the effects of the Chorleywood bread process. It was very quickly taken up in the UK, in Australia, in Asia, ex-Commonwealth countries, not in North America because the wheat there was high protein, so it really wasn't needed. One of the biggest effects, which nobody saw coming, was it actually speeded up the closure of the small bakeries that wanted it in the first place. Big bakeries could afford to invest in the machinery that you needed to use the Chorleywood bread process, and the small bakeries just couldn't compete. There aren't actually very good figures for the decline of small bakeries in the UK. There's a thing called the Federation of Bakers in the UK, and they estimate that right now, large bakeries are 85% of sales, and supermarket in-store bakeries are 12%. High street bakers, by which we mean kind of small chains, independent bakers, not in big shopping malls or anything like that, they're about 3%. And many of them are in any case using versions of the Chorleywood bread process. And home baking, even after the pandemic resurgence, you can ignore it. It's just a rounding error. So although Chorleywood didn't save the small bakeries, it did solve the problem of wheat imports. The amount of wheat that the UK got from Canada fell from 2.5 million tons in the early 1960s when Chorleywood came in to 250,000 tons today. And it's been estimated that that saved the British economy, British bakers, about £45 million. So yeah, it definitely had an impact. Another thing is that people associate the Chorleywood bread process with the kind of fluffy sliced loaf. Actually, this is a slightly wholemeal, slightly seedy loaf, you see. But you can tweak it to make almost any kind of bread. You can change the pressure in the mixer, you can change the composition of the gas in the mixture, and that can give you a fine, even crumb like you might want in a sandwich loaf, or you can get it to give you a coarse and open crumb like you might get in a baguette. And you can adjust the crust too. You can have a thin, soft crust or a thick and crispy crust. And most of the, well, I would say almost all of the, quote, interesting, unquote, breads you find in the supermarket are made with the Chorleywood bread process. Which brings us to, I suppose, the heart of the matter, which is whether this bread, Chorleywood bread process bread, is any good. And this is really difficult because what makes a loaf of bread good depends to some extent, to a large extent, on what you expect. I mean, if you buy a wrapped slice loaf and you open it up and it has a hard crust, you're going to say that's a stale loaf. But if you buy a baguette and it has a soft crust, you're going to say that that's a stale loaf. But judging the quality of a loaf is really very difficult and very personal. But two of the scientists behind the CBP said this. They said the advent of the CBP went largely unremarked by the British public. And then they say perhaps this was because the introduction of the Chorleywood bread process to the UK bread left UK bread quality relatively unchanged. They seem to be saying nobody noticed. But they also have, as I mentioned, they have a very narrow definition of quality. And here I've pulled out the key for that very long quote I showed right at the beginning. They define quality as bread volumes, softness, and cell structure. In other words, the crumb. And this chap, Elton, was the boss of the British Baking Industries Research Association. And he said, the process gives bread, which is better in respect of volume, texture, color, and keeping qualities, and is indistinguishable in flavor from bread baked from the conventional 3-hour fermentation process. And that suggests two things to me. Probably that British bread might not have been that good before. I really don't know about that. But some of the people who advocate for the Chorleywood bread process say that, I mean, when you read criticism, they say flavor is reduced in some views, and they say detractors of the process have, quote, no real understanding of the processes by which bread flavor is developed. And I think that's kind of disingenuous. I don't think you need to know how the flavor is developed to detect the differences. I mean, the best advice I give anyone who wants more flavor in their bread is to follow Elizabeth David's advice in English Bread and Yeast Cookery and use a half or a quarter of the yeast in the recipe and let the dough rise for twice or 4 times as long. And this is the crux of the matter. The CBP, Chorleywood bread process, saves time. Bakers could make much tastier bread using this Chorleywood bread process, but apparently shoppers don't want that. The Chorleywood bread process has always been about producing a greater volume of bread at the lowest possible cost. This is what I found in another book. The Chorleywood process is chosen by bakeries that decide to make the cheapest possible bread. This sort of production did not enhance the reputation of the product. And I think that really gets to it. And there's a whole nother question. Let me stop sharing briefly for a minute. Stop sharing, where are you? Okay. There. There's a whole nother question of why it is that British consumers apparently failed to notice the advent of the Chorleywood bread process. I was intrigued to find an essay by Paul Krugman, a Nobel Prize winning economist, about this, Krugman thinks it's an example of a very rare economic phenomenon, which is called a bad equilibrium. So in a free market economy, a bad equilibrium is one in which people don't demand good things because they've never been supplied before, and they're not supplied because not enough people demand them. And Krugman's talking about British cookery in general, and he's very dismissive, and I don't actually agree with him on most British cookery. But as far as bread is concerned, maybe, I mean, he says by the time it became possible for urban Britons to eat decently, they no longer knew the difference. And there may be something to that. It may be that the sort of fondly remembered high street bakery bread of the past wasn't all that good. So one of the possibly beneficial effects of the Chorleywood bread process is that, unlike me starting to bake because I didn't like the homemade bread I was being offered, it seems quite clear that the rise of the Chorleywood bread process and other industrial bread processes fueled the demand among a very, very small clientele for the type of bread we think that it replaced. That is to say, bread where time rather than energy and hands rather than machines made the bread. There are no good figures on the rise of artisan bakers or craft bakers or even micro bakeries with clients in the low two figures. But it's definitely a thing. I mean, this has definitely happened. I do know supermarket sales have declined over the past by about 12% over the past 5 years, but I don't know, in the UK, but I don't know whether people are getting their bread somewhere else or giving up on it entirely. But the other bit of evidence that speaks to the rise of artisan bread is, God, is this. Industrial bakers can buy a bag of sourdough flavor. No need to maintain a sourdough starter. You've got wheat flour, fumaric acid, lactic acid, malic acid, acetic acid, all of which are present in sourdoughs, and you get, quote, sourdough bread, which has resulted in more campaigns, certainly in the UK. I don't know, again, I'd be happy to hear from you about what's happening in the US, but in the UK and Australia, they call it sour faux, and there's a huge campaign, which is getting nowhere, I have to add, about what you're allowed to call, whether you're allowed to call this sort of stuff sourdough bread. And just as artisan bread has become more popular with a small segment of the audience, so too artisan has become completely meaningless. This is a sandwich I bought in an airport. I don't know if you can see, but right down at the bottom, under classic cheese, it says artisan baked bread. Well, if that's artisan baked bread, I'm an industrial bread baking machine. You know, it's just absurd. So I don't know what you call artisan bread these days. If Beamster, who made that sandwich, can call that artisan baked bread. Anyway, let's leave that for now and talk a little bit about health. Too many keyboards. I don't want to get into health, to be honest. There are lots and lots of health claims around industrial bread. There are health claims around sourdough bread. There are health claims around proper craft bread, everything else. People certainly report all sorts of effects, good effects and bad effects that they experience. And I'm not here to deny anyone's experience. I would say that there are no, what I would call proper trials of the effects of different bread production processes, which I think it would be very difficult to do anyway. Nevertheless, that doesn't stop people having strong opinions. I'm happy talk about those, but it's not something I have. I have strong opinions about the fact that people have strong opinions. That's about as far as it goes. I know what I like. I know what's good for me. So, yeah, let me finish up with a couple of more things about Chorleywood. A lot of people describe Chorleywood bread, Wonder Bread, as trash. I don't agree with that. It provides an affordable source of calories to millions of people around the world. The tragedy is that by making bread so cheap, it has devalued bread as a food. My very first trip to America, I was a camp counselor in Vermont, and I had 4 delightfully unruly 8-year-old boys to look after. And I think it was the 2nd or the 3rd day at lunch, one of them spilled the Kool-Aid and another one of them reached for the Wonder Bread and mopped it up. And that kind of pained me even then. I was 18. So I do think that that's something that good bakers fight against, is this notion that bread needs to be really cheap. And so that's a bad side, but the good side is that I think it has prompted the rise of artisan bakeries. And I think that that has pushed forward local bakeries, regional grain economies, freshly milled flours, all the things that I know you and I think are a good idea. It's been fun over the last 3 months or so of the lockdown to watch the explosion of home bread baking unfolding on social media. And I know there are many, many future PhDs to be written on the great COVID bread baking. Of course, I hope that at least some of these people continue to bake bread once the emergency is over. Because in the end, and this is totally personal, this is my motivation. Baking your own bread is just so much more satisfying in so many more ways than just having good bread to eat. A couple of things I want to talk about outside of Chorleywood. I'm happy to. No, I think let me finish and then we'll take questions and talk about it. One of them is one of the things is what new bakers expect. And I'm sure you've seen this on social media, in baking forums, wherever you hang out. Because bread has become such an industrial product, new bakers seem to want consistency and perfection every time. And I'm sure I don't want to say to them, just get over the fact that your bread didn't rise so well this time. Okay, it's underproofed and overbaked. It's still edible. Okay, it wasn't Instagram worthy. It's still edible and nourishing. But I haven't done much of that because I don't think I'm temperamentally suited to do that. I think any baker will tell you that you just need to keep working at it, and eventually, and you work at 1 or 2 recipes and eventually they come good. And there've been some kind of stellar recipes that have gone viral, which is a very unfortunate term. And people have had trouble with them because they expect it to be the same every time, no matter what the temperature of your room, no matter what your altitude, no matter what your sourdough starter is doing. I mean, the obsession with getting your starter to float. My flour starter sometimes floats, sometimes doesn't. You learn, you've got to stick with it. And I hope people get into that. But one of the things that's totally destructive is bad instructions. I mean, there's one famous English cook, and her recipe for bread includes this sentence. I haven't made a slide of it. She says, make a well in the center and pour in all the hand hot water. Then mix the water into the flour gradually to form a dough. The exact amount of water you'll need will depend on the flour. Well, she told us how much water we needed. She told us to pour all of it into the middle of the flour. So what's all this about exact amounts of water? So anyway, I mean, this is something I get a little bit too aerated about, but I've said my piece. The other thing I want to mention is about the history of wheat and modern wheat breeding and wheat quality. I completely understand why people are so keen on heritage grains. One of my podcasts a couple of years ago was dedicated to red fife, its origin story, how it nearly didn't make it, how Farmer Fife's wife rescued single ear, all of that. And red fife was basically the making of the Canadian prairie wheats. And those wheats came south. They took over the American wheatlands. That fed into the growth of industrial milling in Minneapolis. And the next thing you know, you've got Pillsbury and General Mills, and that's about all. So I do understand the idea that if you want to return to a simpler time, you return to older wheats. There's a little evidence to suggest that the mineral content of older wheats may be higher than modern wheats, but it's complicated by them not being grown in exactly the same conditions. And I just want to say that there are some great things happening in conventional wheat breeding, reversing the Green Revolution. The Green Revolution was all about making the environment fit the wheat. So you irrigated, you fertilized, you killed the weeds. Modern wheat breeding is much more about making the wheat fit the environment. And it makes a lot more sense these days because you have local grain economies which are growing and they're making use of local grains. And there's a wheat on the southeast coast of the United States called Appalachian White, which a lot of people think is a heritage wheat. I mean, if you've got red fife and Turkey red and Appalachian White, oh, it's probably an old wheat that was grown in the Appalachians. It's not. It's a modern wheat and a very fine wheat for that environment. There's the example of synthetic wheat, which has been made using some very interesting laboratory techniques by hybridizing the original 3 different species that gave rise to bread wheat. And that's another terrific breakthrough that will make it possible in future to select for all kinds of characteristics that might have got forgotten or lost in the first domestication of wheat. And even better than both of those, some breeders are going even further. They're allowing the environment to select the wheat that suits it best. It's a technique called population breeding. Basically, you get as many wheat varieties as you can. You cross everyone with everyone else. You create a massively diverse bag of seeds and you plant it. And the ones that like it in that environment thrive, and the ones that don't like it don't thrive. And slowly, I mean, only a couple of years, the population evolves to be really well adapted to the environment. And because it's diverse, the yield is pretty stable from year to year. If conditions are changing in a particular direction, say getting drier or hotter, the population can usually adapt along with it. And that's a really, what's the word? It's a really hopeful approach, which is going really well in England and here in Italy. And people are beginning to sit up and take notice. People who are interested in quality wheats for which they get a better price. And then the final thing I want to talk about is soft Durham wheat. Durham wheat is really hard. It's fabulous for all sorts of things, but it's a nightmare to mill. And with some very advanced laboratory techniques, the Bread Lab in Washington State has developed a soft Durham wheat. It has all the beneficial qualities of Durham wheat, but you can mill it in an ordinary wheat mill. And I think that's going to be quite a game changer looking forward. So, I mean, my final word on that is yes, I think it's important to love, cherish, honor old wheat varieties, but not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I mean, there's a lot of good stuff happening in modern wheat breeding. Okay, that's me done, I think. What's the time? Oh my gosh, I haven't left it all. Thank you very much. I'm ready to hand back. How do I hand back to you, Dan?
Yeah, I think I just press this handy reclaim host button. And
Okay.
yeah, there we go. So yeah,
Okay.
as questions come in, that's great. Might have. I see a question from Dina, and I don't know if it's a question or as much of a statement. Let's see here. It says, if affordable source of calories is not a goal, might have been the case after World War II, she mentions, then nutrition, flavor, etc. should be in place. Oh, it's a statement I see. So yeah, I think just kind of building on a little bit of what you were saying too there, Jeremy, about nutrition and flavor and maybe some of these other things that are coming out of all this different types of wheat breeding out there.
Right. I would agree absolutely. And the question is, not just in bread, but everything. The the pursuit of industrial food is cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, and we've lost sight of what we pay with in terms of health, in terms of nutrition. So yeah, I agree. I agree with that.
So I have a question for you. It seems like in Europe, Europeans tend to spend a little bit more of their percentage of their income on food than Americans do. Are you seeing any of those, regional grain economies developing or having a renaissance around you in Rome or in other places in Europe? Do you see that kind of developing, even just apart from this COVID period of home baking, but do you see these regional economies developing?
Much more so in the UK than I'm aware of in Europe, continental Europe. I know of 3, maybe 4 regional grain economies in the UK. Scotland, the bread is pioneering that. There's one in the southwest of England, which is a very, very much wetter climate than East Anglia. There's one in the Midlands. So I'm aware of those. Here, it's much less organized. It's strange. It's very, very strange. But I mean, like the population breeding, there's an NGO which is working mostly with organic and biodynamic farmers to spread the word about the population wheats. But the farmers themselves are not concentrated in any one area. So you've got people in Sicily, you've got people in Molise, you've got people up in the north of Italy growing these wheats and being advised, but it hasn't really developed to that point yet. I mean, one thing I find interesting is that it's really hard to get a 10-pound, a 5-kilo bag of flour here. I get it by mail order. In the UK, a big supermarket will stock a 5-kilo bag of flour. And I guess that's true in the US as well. But you don't see that here. Home baking, people do home bake, and they certainly make pasta. But I'm not seeing quite the same level of organization around local grain economies.
Great, yeah. Thank you for that.
I know of nowhere to buy wheat berries. I mean, no, that's not true. I can buy 500 grams of a non-specific wheat berry. I don't know what it is, but I can't buy 5 kilos of a known variety in Italy without going to a farmer who might let me have some.
No, thank you for that answer. I know I grew up in Colorado in the 80s, and I think we were a Roman meal family. It was the bread we ate, which at least I think Roman meal has at least a little bit more brand than maybe Wonder Bread. But it's been really exciting to see the small bakeries opening up and more people supporting them. And then, to see these small bakeries, the bakers, you know, starting to source more regional grains and being able to do a little bit more milling in on site and things like that. So they're, because it seemed like growing up, you know, if there was a small bakery, they were accessing a lot of the same wheat that the grocery store would use in their home bake, you know, in-store bakery and stuff too. So it wasn't much of a difference. And it seems like there really is
No,
now. So
no. I think there's a different, the bakery just down the street here, which is a classic local Roman bakery, they get a tanker, pulls up to the curb, and the flour is pumped into their flour bins. Now their breads are okay, it's not great, but the point is you can make good bread with industrial flour. I mean, you can add taste by using a long fermentation and all the rest of it. One of the interesting things, and I know Andy was talking about it when I visited Moxie, is the idea of a baker who is milling, also selling flour to home bakers. And I think that's really exciting, but I've seen nothing like that here.
So I'll combine two questions here on nutrition. One is asking, you know, can you manipulate nutritional content of bread by how you prepare it? And then the second question was just saying, you know, I heard a rumor that modern wheat is not as nutritious as it used to be. Just wondering if that's true.
Yeah, I mean, modern wheat is not as nutritious in certain regards. I mean, it does contain fewer minerals, less iron, less zinc, a few other things. It's not clear how much difference that makes to the diet. I just don't know. You can add nutrition because, particularly if you take something like whole wheat bread, the bran contains these substances that locks up phytates, that lock up some of the minerals. A longer fermentation destroys some of the phytates, which releases the minerals. So that's one thing. The other thing is that the organisms in a starter and yeast are, yeast is not just producing carbon dioxide and alcohol. It's producing all the things we call flavors, and that includes some nutritious compounds. So definitely you can add nutrition by having a longer fermentation and by having a mixed ferment. I mean, a sourdough.
Great, thank you. This is a great question. Maybe a simplistic question Benita says in here, but I don't think it is. If an ingredient like ascorbic acid helps during the rising process, would something such as lemon juice give a bread a softer texture and less aggressive, chemically manipulative way?
That is an interesting question. The ascorbic acid, yeah, I think you're better off, frankly, using a vitamin C tablet. I mean, if that's what you want, crush a vitamin C tablet and put a little bit in, because the lemon juice is going to affect the pH of the dough in a much more than merely its ascorbic acid, and that's going to change the fermentation of the yeast. But the whole point of the sourdough is that it's balancing the lactobacilli, which are making things acidic, and the yeast, and they're feeding each other. If you use a pure yeast and make it very acidic, relatively acidic, it might not work as well.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, I guess part of that's experimentation. Well,
Yeah.
and I should also introduce Andrew Calabrese. He's our support staff today as a panelist and making sure if my internet goes down, we don't all go down with it. So Andrew, sounds like Andrew has a question as well.
Yeah, hi, Jeremy.
Hey, Andrew.
I have a question about the scale of bread baking. The Chorleywood process clearly served a vital need because it enabled the mass production on a scale that was did not exist before then. one of the things that we see with artisan bread baking is that there's an upper limit on what a small bakery with a small deck oven can do. The bread is wonderful and we all love it. And aside from the home bakers who are learning this craft as well, which is wonderful. I was wondering if you had anything you'd like to say about your vision, what you see as the future of the kind of high quality bread that we're seeing this renaissance of today. Do you think it's something that will continue to grow, and is it going to become more affordable as a result?
I don't want it to become more affordable. I really don't, Andrew. I think what needs, the change needs to be, it needs to become perceived as better value. So yes, I can buy a white sliced loaf for $1.99, whatever. I don't even know the price of bread in the US at the moment. I know in Britain, I didn't get this number ready. A huge amount of bread is thrown away because it's perceived as cheap. When you pay, 10 euros for a half a loaf from Poilâne, you don't throw that away. You savor it, you eat it. It's much more nutritious. You don't eat nearly as much. So I don't want to see artisan bread become cheaper. I want it to become better valued by the people who buy it. It's the same, it's my same spiel about meat. I don't want to see organic meat competing on, or extensive meat competing on price. I want people to eat half as much meat and pay twice as much for it. Mm-hmm. So for me, the future of, my dream world is sort of like a hub and spokes. So my dream world is a bakery like, say, Moxie, or in London, E5, that invests in a mill, that invests in local farmers, that creates supply chains for the mill. And that, either that is attached to a bakery or it is independent of bakeries. And that mill, which can easily do 500 kilos a day, even a small mill, supplies a network of smaller bakeries who sell out every day, maybe even by order. I think this subscription bread model is terrific. I think it partly depends. Part of the problem, I don't know how it is in Colorado, but part of the problem is you can't just sell bread out of your kitchen. But now because I can't travel to the office where I used to work, but in January, I was baking 12, 15 loaves a week. No big deal. But 12 to 15 people were paying me a little bit of money and getting my bread. I see no reason why a person couldn't bake for their neighbors. I see no reason why a group of 2 or 3 people couldn't bake for a street or 3 or 4 streets. It depends partly on how your city works, whether people can come and get it, but there are these models of cottage bakeries that have got a little bit bigger. They work. The problem is sourcing the flour. So my dream world is a small mill in a central location, supplying flour to a bunch of bakers at a variety of scales, from a loaf a week to 100 loaves a week.
Yeah, and Kim was mentioning in the chat box, and yeah, that she's absolutely correct that in Colorado we do have some cottage food licensing that's allowed. So it's mostly based on taking a class to make sure you understand some health and safety measures, and then there's certain levels of gross income you can bring in from that. But it's been neat to see some of that cottage food come on, and now it's changing to allow not only bread and baked goods, but fermented products and other cottage food items. So that's neat to see. And speaking of just sourcing things, Luigi was asking. We know here in Boulder area, we can get a lot of great stuff from Moxie, but he was asking, what's the best place to find seeds of heritage varieties? And I don't know if that's a question more about sourcing seeds for farming, or if it's wheat berries, or maybe either. If you know of any other sources on the good old World Wide Web that you recommend.
No, I have to say no, I don't. I mean, the joy of seeds is that if you want to grow them, and you have time, you don't need more than a handful. It'll take you time, but you can end up with several acres worth. For grinding your own, I just don't know. But they are out there on the web. The cost of transport is high. They're heavy. That's why they travel in rail cars.
Well, I guess we got time for one more question, if that's all right with you, Jeremy.
Yeah.
I know you said you didn't want to get too much into, the effects of health and wellness on consumers, when it comes to different kinds of bread. But there's just a question here from Dina saying, as a scientist, what is your advice for the process of correlating science or sciences to the explosion of gluten sensitivities, and just following the new market of gluten-free baking? Is it not as nutritious? What I know this is a huge question, so in a short answer, kind of what are your thoughts kind of on that whole proliferation of sensitivities, but then also this whole new market of gluten-free products?
Yeah, well, who's benefiting from this market of gluten-free products? A lot of people self-identify. If spending twice as much for a product makes you feel better, who am I to argue? I spend twice as much on good bread or good meat. So I think, look, for sure there are celiacs, for sure. There are people with Crohn's disease, no doubt in my mind. A lot of the rest of it, and by it I mean gluten sensitivity, wheat belly, all these things, I don't suffer from them. So I'm deeply cynical. I'm deeply cynical about it. But I don't want to stop anybody having the opportunity to say, I'm gluten-free, and I want products that seem to be like gluten-containing products, because that's the other issue. I mean, is bread, muffins, waffles, it's so complex. It's so tied up in what you think you ought, quote unquote, to be eating. I mean, if I wanted something that didn't contain gluten, on which to spread jam or to eat with a bit of cheese, I'm not sure I'd want gluten-free bread. I think there are other options. You could have a dosa. You could have a rice pancake. You could have some of those styrofoam rice things. You could have corn chips. I get this is purely personal. I don't want to knock anybody's choices. I don't want to say you shouldn't be choosing these things, but I wouldn't be. That's all I can say.
Yeah, no, I think that's a delicate answer, and I think what you really highlight there is just our power of choice and the value of the consumer dollar to support food systems that you believe in, and I guess that's a good transition back to the Colorado Grain Chain. Folks they can sign on to coloradograinchain.com and become members if they choose. But that's, supporting amazing bakers like Andy over at Moxie and others, but also that full system to be able to continue creating these opportunities all the way back to the farmer who's producing it, and supporting those rural communities as well, where a lot of this grain comes from. So I'll invite people there. Folks can also find this recording and others. There are links on the Colorado Grain Chain website to take you to YouTube and watch these other recordings. And then also, if you become a member, there's a bunch of forbidden knowledge on that website of recipes and other tips and other resources for info. So I welcome anybody for that. But thank you so much for joining us today, Jeremy. We really appreciate your time.
Thanks, Jeremy. It's
yeah,
fantastic.
Especially being eight time zones away. We really appreciate your flexibility. So
yeah, it's only 8 o'clock here. Time. I mean, we eat late here. Thank you very much. Thank you to everybody who took part. Thank you for some great questions. And well, if any of you want more information from me, I'm happy for Dan or Andrew to share my email. Not a problem.
Well, thank you so much for that. We really appreciate it.
Take care.
All righty. Take care, everyone.
Bye.
Have a great one.
Bye.